Okay, welcome to the second module on EDU510. We're going to be talking about coming to your research problem, the literature review, and ethics. And all of these are essential to the whole process of doing research. In this module, you'll be reading two chapters from Creswell and Guterman. They provide a detailed look at coming to your research problem in Chapter 2 and literature reviews in Chapter 3 for both quantitative and qualitative research. Marshall, Rossman, and Blanco take on the complexities of doing qualitative work and consider the complex ethical positioning of the research as well as the centrality of ethics to qualitative research. I'll talk about the other authors in a moment. And in addition to the readings listed here, you'll be participating in the forum as well as completing your statement of your research area assignment, for which there is a separate video in the submitting your assignment section of eClass. In other words, this is a busy module, and so staying on top of it will be important. So remember that I'm here to support you in doing just that. Alison Brophy and Helen Raptis are both non-Indigenous researchers, but their article is about, as non-Indigenous educators, what is their moral positioning in working within Indigenous communities. They're based at the University of Victoria and are interested in working cross-culturally to support students from JK to K to adult learners from all cultural backgrounds, but with a particular interest in Indigenous learners. Their article is especially important in thinking about the ethical positioning of non-Indigenous researchers working with Indigenous peoples and communities. Andreas Ekstrom's passion is digital equality. That is, he hopes to see a world in which wealth is shared, not only financially, but also in terms of knowledge and influence. He's a Norwegian journalist, author, and digital futurist, and his TED Talk pushes us to think critically about how knowledge, particularly digital knowledge, is produced, and what are the ethics of that knowledge production. His video is a really fascinating look at thinking critically about the trustworthiness of the knowledge upon which we rely. This is a video that, while brief, is well worth continued reflection. And Julie Bull is Inuk and a powerhouse who works with government agencies and in academia based at the University of Toronto. Her primary interest is in the ethics of doing research with Indigenous peoples. Her video is a masterclass in the history and policy background of ethical positions in relation to Indigenous peoples. Well worth watching closely. It's really, really excellent. Your assignment in this module is to decide on and make a statement about your chosen area of research. And you can feel a bit like this guy right here, or this person right here, looking at a wall of all kinds of indistinguishable stuff. And sometimes you can feel that way when you're beginning the process of coming to your research question. But remember, this is the first step in the complex process of identifying your research question. So let's look at that process in more detail. During 510, you will eventually develop a statement of the research problem as a part of the process of deciding on your research question that you're going to explore in your research project. That will start in your next course in the summer. As Creswell and Guterman suggest, coming to your question is a process, an essential and important process that is comprised of several steps. And we'll begin that process in this module through your readings and the assignment you will engage in during this module. So let's look at how that process evolves. First, getting from a general area of research interest to a doable research question is a process that moves from the general to the specific. In my own case, for my doctoral work, I began with the general area of interest in gender equity policy and education. The research problem was the phenomenon of resistance to the implementation of that gender equity policy in school systems that I was observing as I went into schools, as I talked to students in my classes, as I talked to colleagues at the university, and so on. My purpose then was to study how resistance was manifest in school systems, and the specific question I explored was, what are the forms of resistance encountered by gender equity officers in implementing gender equity policy in educational organizations? Creswell and Guterman provide another example of this whole process of moving from a more general area of research down to a research question. And we're in this course, as was mentioned, going to be completing the first two steps. The purpose statement is not one that is always done, actually. So you may or may not end up doing a purpose statement, but you'll definitely be doing a research question when you get to your next course in the summer. So they were looking at a researcher who was interested in online learning. That researcher was particularly the problem that researcher was looking at, the problem that they were dealing with in the context of this broader area of interest was the lack of students enrolled in online learning. So the problem is just that. It is a problem that needs to find some kind of answer, solution, understanding, whatever. For me, it was how could I better understand this resistance that was being experienced. In this case, the lack of students enrolled in online learning. The purpose statement is to study why students do not enroll in online classes at a community college. So that was the context in which this problem was being manifest. And the research question then does, and it's in the form of a hypothesis, says the use of the internet deters students from enrolling in an online class. So here, that opens up an opportunity for both qualitative or quantitative research. Part of coming to a statement of your research problem and your eventual research question is locating where your research is situated in the literature. That is, in exploring the topic, what do we already know about it? What do we not know about it? How will my research contribute to the literature that exists? Creswell and Guterman provide good advice about doing your literature review, and because the information they share is explained clearly, I'm not going to spend a whole amount of time here regurgitating their excellent advice, other than to say that in Chapter 3, they discuss the literature review and consider the practical steps in identifying the focus for your literature search, locating literature, critically evaluating, and selecting the literature you use for your research, then organizing and writing up your literature review. So in addition to their excellent advice, I'll just suggest some practical tips that may be helpful. First of all, make sure that you are able to identify key terms that are going to help you in your literature search. You might want to find them by considering a potential title for your research or come up with a sentence of 25 words or less to distill your ideas to their key components. You can then build on those keywords from there. And often when you type in keywords, the search engine will actually make suggestions as well. So if you've got somewhere to start, it will help you move along that process. Once you've put together some key terms, you can begin to locate the literature available. And this is where you need, in fact, even when you're doing your key terms, get to know your librarian. They'll be your best friend. If you can get into the library, that's great because you can actually meet up with them and have them help you in person. If you can't, on the library website, you can use the Ask Me a Question box on the website, because there's actually, I discovered, there's actually a real person at the other end who is willing and very able to help you out, and they've helped me out often. They're excellent. So use the resources that are available, and make sure that you take advantage of what's already there. When you're locating literature, though, see the cautionary notes and instructor notes, as well as consider Ekstrom's video discussion about judging the trustworthiness of academic literature. In order to find reliable and useful literature, use reliable and useful sources, ones that are peer-reviewed, that have an editor and an editorial board affiliated with reputable university or universities, that are quoted regularly, that have a reputation for good research. And if you aren't clear about that, talk to some people in the field of that kind of research and see, what are the journals that they regularly go to, or in your articles that you're reading, what are the journals that people regularly are finding information in, and often that will take you in the right direction as well. That is, evaluate the quality of the literature you are identifying as well as its value to your study. You'll need to evaluate whether this article, which may be very worthy and interesting, actually enhances your understanding of your particular research problem or question. Just because an article is interesting doesn't necessarily mean that it's going to be helpful. So those are differentiators that need to be paid attention to as well. Then you need to organize the literature, and you can do that through a computer list that is constantly alphabetized or re-alphabetized. File cards you might want to use, but digital organizing is probably easier. There are systems that can be used through the library as well, and if you can talk to the librarian about those as well and how to use them, so that you can build, quite a large body of literature that you can draw from. You'll be glad you did when you're finalizing your last edit of your project and you discover a quote that has no reference but is essential to the point you are making, and you don't know where to look for a reference, so you spend most of 3 days locating it. Ask me how I know. So the suggestions I'm making to you aren't necessarily ones I always followed, but boy, there were lots of times when I wished I did. So, when we start this process with the literature review assignments, it's an excellent place to continue gathering information electronically. And you can, if you come across a quote in an article that one of the articles that you're looking at that might be helpful in the future, write it down and the page number that it's on, so that you've got all of that information together, and it just becomes a habit that is very helpful to your process eventually. The annotated literature review assignment that's upcoming will be helpful in enabling you to begin to go through this process in a more limited way, and will enable you to explore one way of writing up an annotation for each literature source, as well as a synthesis across the literature chosen. This assignment will be helpful in understanding this important part of the research process, including for your eventual research project, even if you change your area of inquiry, and that may happen, but hopefully it won't, because you're going to be spending a lot of time and you might as well use that time wisely. Whatever your research topic ends up being, however, ethics will be at the heart of everything you do as a researcher. Marshall et al. Identify ethics as both big E ethics and little e ethics, and both of these are essential. So by big E ethics, we mean the research ethics boards and the processes that you are required to go through. You're going to have to do a mini course, if you haven't already, online that talks about all of this stuff related to the big E ethics. We have a research ethics board at the University of Alberta. Your proposed research will have to go through that research ethics board in some way. It may be through a group ethics application that's already been done, and if your research fits within the parameters of that broader research ethics proposal, then you can go ahead with your research. Otherwise, you may have to go through the whole research process, and it can be timely. And oftentimes you not only need to get permission from the Research Ethics Board, but also from the Board of Education that you're working with. And that can take a very long time because they don't meet nearly as often, for example. The big E ethics protect against liability concerns, among other things, but that's one of the big ones. So it protects not only the university from things that might happen during a research project of one of their students, it protects that student as well that's conducting the research, and so so there's support in that way. Now in education, it's not often that anything gets to that point because of the kind of research that education researchers tend to do. But for example, in medicine or psychology, sometimes, and other areas, sometimes there are greater concerns, and they may lead to legal issues of some kind. So your big E ethics are important in that way. Your small E ethics are embedded in everything you do as researchers. Ethics, Marshall, Rossman, and Blanco say, ethics requires a focus on matters of relationships with stakeholders, with peers, and with a larger community of discourse. We remind you of the words respectful, fair, and caring. And you're going to hear those words and words like them repeated by other authors that I'm going to talk about in a moment. Marshall, Rossman, and Blanco take on the particular ethical complexities of doing qualitative research and argue that ethics is a part of everything that's done in qualitative research. Because qualitative research is a complex area of inquiry in which concepts are constantly contested, its methodologies and methods can be complex, but at their heart, they are premised on relationships with participants and stakeholders, and sometimes in very complex social contexts. Transparency is essential then in order for the researcher to, as fully as possible, understand their positionality in relation to others and particularly in relation to those they are researching. So these three together, ethics, relationships, transparency, comprise a level of trustworthiness that needs to be the goal of qualitative research. This requires a strong and well-informed sense of ethics. As Marshall et al. State, viewing the moral principles that guide research practice as relational rather than merely as a procedural hoop one must jump through like big E ethics are, centers the inquiry on people, which we argue is where it should be. Just remember those simple words, respectful, fair, and caring. So let's look at how ethics are central in working in the specific context of Indigenous communities. Brophy and Raptis, as well as Bull, argue that decolonizing research is carried out by those with particular values, ethics, morals that are necessary to ensure sustainable research with Indigenous communities and Indigenous populations. As educators, we are challenged then to reflect carefully on the moral and ethical components we bring to our research with Indigenous peoples. Brophy and Raptis explore the literature and draw on several Indigenous scholars, including some from the University of Alberta, who outline those ethical characteristics. First is responsibility and trust. That is, we'll keep information confidential and will be accountable to the community. Next is humility. That is, respectful, willing to place the needs of the community above their own, and does not rush to judgment when actions are different than their own values would generally support, rather to accept those actions as fulfilling the needs and values of the community. That's an important one, and they go into more detail in the article. A broad worldview helps as the researcher understand that there are many ways of being in the world. Reciprocity is key in light of the terrible history of many researchers in the past in Indigenous communities. Instead, research interests must benefit both the researcher and the community, and many Indigenous communities will insist on that. Relational accountability is another key value in which reciprocity, trust, and respect come together in the sense that we are all connected to all things, and therefore there is a moral responsibility to ensure that no harm comes to the community. And all of this requires deep listening within relationship. And last is self-identity. That is an awareness of oneself, knowledge of who one is, and why the research is being done. And this has direct implications for the research methodology and how that is negotiated with the community in the community's interest. Julie Bull provides a briefer version that encapsulates the Brophy and Raptis paper and much of what Marshall et al. Said earlier as well, when she lists the following as essential to ethical research in Indigenous communities. She says these are the characteristics that are essential: respect, relevance, reciprocity, responsibility, and relationship. Hostetler, which is someone we aren't reading, but who wrote an article that we use in this course, considers the question, what is good research? Up until now, our readings, for example, Creswell and Guterman, have suggested that good research is research that is methodologically supportable. And that is something that we could recommend as being done correctly or corresponds to best research practice. Of course, that's very important. But Hostetler asks a much more philosophical question: what is good research? He asks this question from the perspective of an education philosopher whose research specialization is the study of ethics, and he makes a statement near the end of the paper that summarizes his discussion and raises broader possibilities for research in a larger philosophical and ethical question related to research in Indigenous communities or with Indigenous peoples. He says, as education researchers, we have a particular obligation and opportunity to take a leading role in seeing that the research that is done is truly good research. As we do our work, we need to think beyond questions of how we will study students or analyze school communities. We need to think about how we can make life better for people. We need to think beyond our taken for granted ideas of well-being and what is good, and make those ideas the objects of serious communal inquiry. Serving people's well-being is a great challenge, but it is always and also our greatest calling. His article challenges all of us to consider this central ethical question: how will my research make life better for my school, my community, the wider society? And as you consider your research problem and the research area that you're beginning this whole quest with, I hope you'll be considering that question as well. As you consider your research, your area of research, and build your statement about it, you are taking that first important step in the eventual narrowing of your focus on a particular research question, something that I hope leads to good research.